Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Welcome to the 2024 College Football Team Autopsy Report. An autopsy report is a document that summarizes the findings of an autopsy, an examination of a body after death. It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season win total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency, the final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our Chief Medical Examiner and Senior Analyst, Kenneth.
And welcome into the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network Team Autopsy Report, South Carolina Gamecocks. We're heading over to beautiful Columbia, South Carolina for the next half hour or so. And this is a team that I am really interested in taking a deep dive into, because there were parts during the season that I absolutely thought that this team could absolutely be a college football playoff team. There are other parts where I wasn't sure if they would win 6 games. So let's take a deep dive and see what shakes out with the data. And we'll start right there with the head coach, Shane Beamer. And for all of you who are not familiar, his legendary father, Frank Beamer, head coach there at Virginia Tech, one of my mentors. And to see where Shane is at this point in his career is a little bit interesting. So 4 years as the head coach there at South Carolina, 29 wins, 22 losses. About a winning percentage of 57%. So you want to see that number start to continue to creep up. But coming off of a non-win season, it's going to be imperative for Coach Beamer to not regress and do like he did after the 2022 season when they went 8-5, and then follow that up with a 5-7 campaign. So need to continue to keep this thing rolling in the right direction. So let's start where we always will. And if you're watching on our YouTube channel or streaming this on our Twitter feed at Crunch Time VIP, thank you so much. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, thank you as well. Any data that I reference on the screen, I got you covered here on the pod here. So season win total for the South Carolina Gamecocks was extremely low, 5.5 on that season win total. South Carolina easily cruised past that number, getting you to the pay window very early on. Now, when we look at our in-season composite win total, this is based on 3 very unique but very important predictive statistical data points. We were pretty much spot on with South Carolina. 8.8 is where we had them. So basically, we would have projected them to be a 9-win team. So felt pretty good about where we were with South Carolina during the season. Now, let's talk about the schedule because that is always important as far as a reference point when discussing these teams. Your strength of schedule and your strength of record, 2 different data points, but both are extremely important when evaluating these teams. Your strength of schedule. Now, a team that plays in a conference like the SEC or one of the big conferences, you only really control about 25% of your schedule, which is your non-conference. So do you step up in weight class or do you kind of go the easier route and just try to bank some wins at the expense of your strength of schedule? Well, South Carolina's strength of schedule, 0.569. That was the 12th toughest schedule out of 134 teams last year. Now, their strength of record, basically look at it this way. Their opponent's winning percentage, 583. That gets you to 231st. So while their opponents were power ranked extremely high, their opponent's win-loss record does not reflect that same level of difficulty that you would expect there. So let's dive into the schedule, and then we'll start breaking down the South Carolina Gamecock offense. If you're looking on the screen here on Twitter or YouTube, you'll see the win-loss records as well as the power rankings and game results there. For those of you at home or in your vehicles listening, I'm going to go through the opponent's win-loss record for you. Old Dominion was 5-7. Kentucky was 4-8. LSU 8-4. Akron 4-8. Ole Miss, Alabama, both 9-3. Oklahoma 6-6. Texas A&M 8-4. Vanderbilt 6-6. Missouri 9-3. Stepped out of conference against Wofford, and then ending the season with in-state rival there in the Clemson Tigers. Now, let's talk about how good were the defenses that the South Carolina Gamecock offense went up against last year. We'll use a baseline number of 68 because that's how many Power 4 teams we had in college football last year. So with that 68 number in mind, Kentucky, 13th best defense for us in college football last year. LSU was 29th. And then they had the gauntlet in the middle of the season in between their 2 bye weeks. Ole Miss, 4th best defense. Alabama was 6th. Oklahoma was 8th. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a gauntlet. 3 top 10 teams back to back to back. Coming off their second bye, Texas A&M was 30th. Vanderbilt 32nd. Missouri 20th. And then Clemson 35th. If you average out their opponents from a power ranking standpoint on the defensive side of the ball, South Carolina's offense would have gone up against a defense that would have been on average power ranked about 33rd. That's about a defense on at least an 8-4, possibly 9-3 defense week in and week out. And just kind of looking at their opponents, I would probably lean more towards the 9-3 there when you think about facing 3 top 10 defenses along with facing 5 defenses in the top 20. That is a very difficult schedule. So let's get into the offensive numbers, and I think we're going to see some adjustments here. So if you're not familiar with our podcast in this series, for offense, I'm going to give you the NCAA average, South Carolina's what we'll call accounting stats, what you'll find on any reference website. And then we're going to give you South Carolina's adjusted number for that category. So let's start right there with the points per game. Average team last year scored about 28 points per game. South Carolina was at 31.6. When we adjust that for opponent, goes up a little bit to 33.4 points per game. So a slight improvement there based on the quality of opponents that they faced. Their passing game. Average team last year about 227 yards per game passing. South Carolina was at 220 yards per game, but when we adjust for opponent, goes down to 206 yards per game. So about a 14-yard differential there. That's forced their run game. And when you have a dynamic mobile quarterback, you expect the rushing numbers to be a little bit better. Average team last year, 160 yards per game. South Carolina was at 189 yards per game rushing. When we adjust that for opponent, goes up to 22 yards rushing per game, about a 34-yard per game improvement when we adjust for opponent. And then total offense. Average team about 387 yards per game. South Carolina was at 409. When we adjust for opponent, goes up to 429. So almost a 20-yard per game improvement already on a really explosive offense. Now, let's dive deeper into the numbers. And before I do that, I said we would do this periodically for teams that were either in the college football playoffs or on the cusp of being one of the final teams in. From an overall standpoint, we had South Carolina as the 14th best team last year. Power ranking from just a pure power ranking standpoint, they were 10th in our Crunch Time Sports Advantage College Football Playoff Committee rankings. We had South Carolina as the 14th best team in college football last year. So a team definitely worth the discussion of making the college football playoffs. Now, let's transition back into their offensive metrics here. The average team last year, drives ending with a score, either a touchdown or field goal, was about 40%. South Carolina was at 48.5%. So almost 1 out of every 2 times that they had the ball last year, they were either getting a field goal or a touchdown. That's phenomenal. Now, when we drill down a little bit deeper, average team last year, drives ending with a touchdown, putting up 7 instead of 3. 29% was the average team last year. South Carolina was at 37%. Fantastic job there. Third down conversion. Average team last year about 39%. South Carolina at 43.4%. So fantastic job there. Now, where did this team really struggle? Well, anytime that you have a running quarterback, you're going to give up more sacks because that quarterback is just going to naturally run himself into some sacks during the year. Average team last year gave up about 24 sacks per game. South Carolina was at 36. Combine that with 20 turnovers. Pretty sure at some point that probably cost you a couple of games. And take no look further than 2 games out of the 3 that they lost. The LSU game, they lost 33-36. And then, of course, Alabama, they lost that game 27-25. If they flip either one of those games, I fully expect that South Carolina would have been a team in the college football playoffs with that kind of resume, that kind of strength of schedule. Got to make sure that you're taking care of those opportunities. Sacks and turnovers are always problematic for an offense. Now, final offensive data point here. Our 3 E's. How effective, explosive, and efficient were your offense last year? South Carolina was the 46th best offense as far as being effective. As far as being explosive, they were 34th. And then as far as being efficient, they were 33rd. At the end of the regular season for us here at the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, 38th was the overall offensive ranking for the Gamecocks. And if I had to bullet point this offense, strong running game, but inconsistent passing attack. And we're going to start right there with their returning young phenom at the quarterback position, Lenore Sellers. In 12 games last year, completed about 66% of his passes. That is solid. 2,534 yards passing, 18 touchdowns, 7 INTs. Got to cut down on the INTs there, young man, in your second full year of being a starter there for South Carolina. About 211 yards per game passing. We'll also briefly talk about his numbers as a runner. As a runner, 166 attempts, 674 yards, 4.1 yards per rushing attempt, 7 rushing touchdowns. Now, they're losing their dot tailback in Rocket Raheem Sanders, 183 carries, 881 yards, 4.8 yards per attempt, 11 touchdowns. Folks, if he was in a more traditional offense where his quarterback wasn't eating up some of those rushing attempts, Sanders would have been easily over 1,000 yards. That's not a knock on Sellers. That's just telling you how good Rocket Sanders was for this offense last year. And he will be missed as he's off to the NFL now. Now, let's take a look at the defense for South Carolina and what kind of caliber offenses did they go up against last year. Once again, we're going to use that baseline number of 68. Old Dominion made the cut as our 64th best offense in college football last year. LSU was 21st. Ole Miss was 5th. Alabama was 2nd. Oklahoma was 62nd. Wow. Texas A&M 22nd. Vanderbilt 51st. Missouri was 53rd, and then Clemson was the 13th best offense for us in college football last year. When you look at that, an average power ranking of about 45. This is an offense that this would have been offenses that would have probably been on a week-to-week basis on probably about a 7-5, hoping to get to that 8-4 mark just from a week in and week out basis. The reason for that is Kentucky drags that number down as they were ranked 80th, and then Akron 116th in offense last year. Now, for the defense, I'm just going to give you the two numbers here. I'm going to give you South Carolina's defensive numbers and then what we adjust for opponent. South Carolina last year allowed 17.8 points per game. When we adjust that for opponent, 13.7. Elite caliber defense. As far as their pass defense, 210 yards is what they allowed per game last year. However, when we adjust that for opponent, pass defense, much better than what the surface numbers say. 163 yards per game. 44-yard improvement when we adjust that for opponent. As far as their rush defense, folks, you're talking about elite numbers here. 106 yards per game allowed on the ground. When we adjust for opponent, slight regression to 114 yards. That's still almost 40 yards better than what the average team gave up last year. And then total offense allowed 313 yards per game. But when we adjust that for opponent, once again, 275, almost 100 yards better than the average team last year on defense. The South Carolina defense was absolutely phenomenal. Now, drives ending with a score by their opponents, 20.8%. Even better when you look at how great of a job they did of keeping their opponents out of the end zone. 14.2% of their opponents' drive ended with a touchdown. Opposing bands were not playing the fight song a lot after playing South Carolina. And then third down conversions, this team was absolutely phenomenal. 28% conversion is what their opponents had on third downs. This team also did a great job of getting after the quarterback. 36 sacks for this team last year, and led by some guys who are no longer with the program as they are off to the NFL. Kyle Kennard, in 12 games, 11 and a half sacks, 16 tackles for loss. Nick Emery, dynamic safety there, 88 total tackles, 3 for loss, 4 INTs, and took 2 of those back to the house for pick sixes. So great job there. This defense is losing a lot of quality players, along with Demetrius Knight the second as well off to the NFL. How quickly can you replace not only the production, but the leadership there for South Carolina is going to be the biggest question. When I take a look at their sacks, 36 sacks on the season. To put that in perspective, the average team last year would have had about 24 sacks during the regular season. South Carolina did a great job of getting after the quarterback and was phenomenal on fourth down situations. Their opponents went for it on fourth down 21 times, only converted 6. That's 29% conversion rate, far below the NCAA average. And then you add on top of that forcing 22 turnovers. This defense was absolutely elite, and that's how I would bullet point it. Elite defense. When I look at their 3 E's, as far as effective defense, this was the 6th best defense for us last year. As far as not giving up explosive plays, they were 8th. And as far as efficiency goes, they were the 5th best defense in college football last year. Overall, this defense was our 5th best defense in college football last year. That's how you borderline making the college football playoffs last year. Let's take a look at the special teams. Special teams, I would say, consistent but unspectacular. Their field goal kicking unit was 14 out of 19, about 74%, just a little bit below where the average was last year. Did convert all the extra points. However, here's where this unit was not up to par, and that's the punting unit. 39.6 yards per punt. That ranks in the bottom 10 in college football last year, 125th there. They were +2 in the turnover differential there. Penalties about average, both in as far as penalties and penalty yardage. Let's take a look at Coach Beamer and how he performed last year as far as one-score games and against quality opponents. In one-score games, South Carolina was 3-2. Now, where they did jump up and really impressed me last year was their wins against quality opponents. In 9 games last year, South Carolina was 6 wins and 3 losses. 2 of those losses, as I mentioned, came down to the final moments of the game, both against LSU and Alabama. And as far as Coach Beamer, how aggressive is he on fourth downs? About 14.1% last year. That ranked 65th out of 144 qualifying head coaches last year in college football. And probably justifiably so, as this team was only 11 out of 22 converting on fourth downs. About 50%. When you look at the average team last year, they converted about 53%. So just a little bit below average there. Now, let's take a look at the splits here. How did this team look in the games that they won versus how did they look in the games that they lost from an offensive standpoint? In South Carolina's 9 wins last year, 35.3 points per game, 232 yards per game passing on just 25 attempts, 9.4 yards per attempt, 14.4 yards per completion. This offense was pushing the ball down the field with a lot of success last year. When I look at their leading wide receiver, it was their tight end, Joshua Simon, 40 receptions, 519 yards, 13 yards per reception, did have 7 of the team's receiving touchdowns last year. So he was kind of their big play guy from a tight end standpoint. When you look at their leading wide receiver, Mazio Bennett Jr., 30 receptions, 337 yards receiving, 11.2 yards per reception, only had 3 touchdowns. So gonna need to find that number one wide receiver going into the 2025 season. Their run game was absolutely phenomenal. 44 rushing attempts per game, 193 yards per game rushing, 4.4 yards per rushing attempt. The team averaged about 69 plays in those wins for 425 yards, 6.2 yards per play. When I take a look at their third down conversion, they were converting third downs at about 40%, converting 60% on fourth downs, committed 11 turnovers in those 9 wins. In their 3 losses, offense really struggled, 20 points per game. Pass attempts go up slightly to 28 per game, but the yardage goes down significantly, only 186 yards per game passing, 45 yards per game difference between their wins and losses, 6.6 yards per attempt. Could not push the ball down the field. Same thing with making yards after the catch, 10.2 yards per completion. Run game was still solid even in those 3 losses. 41 rushing attempts per game, 175 yards per game rushing, 4.3 yards per rushing attempt. I mentioned Sanders and Sellers. Even when they were losing, they could still run the ball. Still, 69 plays per game, even in those losses, 362 yards per game. So about a 63 yard per game difference when they lost versus when they won. Their third down conversions, 35%. Fourth down conversion, they go down significantly, only 29% conversion rate on third downs. And as I mentioned, turn the ball over a lot in their losses. 9 turnovers in those 3 games that they lost. Now, let's take a look at their defensive splits. In those 9 wins, 14 points per game. Opponents were throwing the ball about 32 times per game, 489 yards, 6 yards per attempt, 10.5 yards per completion. They were playing phenomenal pass defense in those wins. The run defense, 34 rushing attempts by their opponents for 100 yards, 2.9 yards per rushing attempt. 66 plays per game is what their opponents were running for 289 yards per game in total offense, 4.4 yards per play. Their defense was only allowing 34% conversion on third downs and forced 17 turnovers in those 9 victories. In the 3 losses, defense was giving up 30 points per game. Opponents were throwing the ball 30 times per game, but the yardage goes up dramatically. 260 yards per game. That's a 70-yard differential between when they won and when they lost. 8.7 yards per attempt, 14.4 yards per completion. Opponents still wasn't having a lot of success even in their losses. 37 rushing attempts per game for 125 yards, 3.4 yards per rushing attempt. So it wasn't the rush defense that was causing South Carolina the problems. It was the pass defense. Again, 67 plays per game is what their opponents were running, 385 yards, almost 100 yards differential between their wins and losses as far as total yardage given up by their defense, 5.7 yards per play. Opponents averaging 4 touchdowns per game, converting third downs at a 37% clip, and could only generate 5 turnovers in those 3 losses. So offense was turning the ball over a little bit more. Defense not generating enough opportunities to get the ball back for South Carolina. So let's get to their final grade, and then we'll talk about the final verdict here. The South Carolina Gamecocks will get a grade of an A- from us. Why? You take a look at that performance against quality opponents. 6-3 in the Southeastern Conference, absolutely phenomenal. if you could just sneak out one more of those close losses, you could have made the playoffs. Final verdict, South Carolina was a top 15 team with an elite defense and a strong rushing attack, but inconsistencies in their passing game and situational execution kept this team from making a playoff push in 2024. In our final moments, let me give you 3 keys for the South Carolina Gamecocks that will help propel them in 2025. First key is must improve the pass protection, limit those sacks, and allow more down the field passing. Talked about how Lenore Sellers is going to give up a lot more sacks than the average quarterback would just because he's a running quarterback. That you're going to have to teach him. It's okay to throw the ball away. Coach Parcells would always teach us, if you can end every drive with a punt, that is a quality thing, whether it's a field goal attempt, whether it's an extra point or a punt. But turning the ball over is always going to be a problem. And the more sacks you take on, the more chances you have for that ball to come out. Key number 2, the continuing defensive dominance in spite of losing some of the top tier talent that you lost to the NFL will be paramount for this team next year. And that includes tightening up the pass coverage. You heard me talk about it on the pod here, giving up almost 260 yards per game through the air alone. Got to improve that number when you're talking about what they gave up in those losses. And then key number 3, you got to elevate the special teams performance, particularly the punting unit. You got to be able to flip that field and put your defense in even a more of an advantage by having your opponent's backs up against the goal line and then forcing them to drive 75, 80 yards to put the ball in the end zone. If the South Carolina Gamecocks can focus on these 3 areas, they can absolutely take the next step and not only become a serious contender in the Southeastern Conference, but find themselves in the college football playoffs in 2025.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at CrunchTimeSportsAdvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy Report.